Committee today. This is your first appearance. It may well not be the last, but you are very welcome. As I'm sure you can imagine, we have got a lot of ground to cover in the time that is available, so as succinct answers as possible would greatly assist us. Can I just begin by asking you about the written statement that is going to be tabled today? It says Minister for the Cabinet Office EU exit update. Do you know when that is going to be available?
No, I don't know the timing of today's...
You don't?
No, sorry.
Is this the statement which has been trailed? Is that your understanding?
I honestly have no idea what it is.
You have no idea what it is?
None at all.
Right. Okay. Fine. All right. Well, we will... If it becomes available during the course of the session, we might enlighten ourselves as well as you. Right. Now, the Prime Minister's always said that no deal is better than a bad deal. Just to clear this up, the deal that the government's negotiated is not regarded by the government as a bad deal, is it?
The government thinks it's a good negotiated is a very good deal.
It's a good deal. In other words, so no deal is now worse than the government deal that's been negotiated. That is correct.
The government is obviously much prefers to have its deal passed. Yes, absolutely. So the deal is what we want.
The deal is what we want. And no deal would be worse than that.
And no deal would be a suboptimal outcome.
Suboptimal. All right. Okay. Now, your own assessment shows that it would do the greatest damage to the economy in terms of foregone growth of any of the potential outcomes. Can you just briefly explain to the committee why the government hasn't, therefore, ruled it out?
Well, actually, when we all... together triggered Article 50, a clock started, and the clock runs out on the 29th of March at 11 p.m. And if we do not leave with a deal, we leave without a deal.
So the government is happy to contemplate the kind of damage to the economy, disruption for which a lot of preparation is being made?
The government is preparing for a no deal. I mean, we obviously want to get the deal over the line. We'd like to persuade members of this committee that it is the best route forward, that it is the best deal for the country. It's the only deal that's on offer. But obviously, if there is no deal that's passed by this House, then we would leave the European Union without a deal, and so a reasonable government has to prepare for that eventuality.
Would the 39 billion be paid to the EU in the event of leaving with no deal?
Some of it would have to be, because there are legal obligations that we would have. We've had thousands of civil servants working in Europe over a long period of time, so there's lots of pension liability that resides there. But it would be nowhere near the billions of pounds that you quoted.
So which are the bits that wouldn't be paid?
Well, the multi-annual financial framework, which we wouldn't be participating in, I'd imagine we wouldn't have to pay those chunks. That the 7-year budget programs that the European Commission runs. We signed up to the last one before the referendum even took place, was even mooted. It runs out at the end of 2020, so there's, you could arguably say we don't have to pay the year and a half, or the year and 3/4 of that. So I think that the lawyers would have a good look at this and probably come up with the fact that we would have to pay the debts that we're legally obliged to pay, but no more. Thank you very much.
So some of the 39 billion we're not legally obliged to pay. That is what you're telling the committee in the event of there being no agreement.
I believe so.
You believe so?
Yeah.
Has the work been done to divide them up? Because you say that lawyers would have to look at it, but that's quite an important statement you've just made.
There's a huge amount of work that's been done on the deal and the financial settlement for the deal.
Sure.
Less has been done on the area that we're discussing at this point in time.
Right, it'd be very helpful if you could speedily give the committee a note about what we would be obliged to pay and what we wouldn't, because that's very significant information that you've just given. Okay, thank you very much indeed. What is your current planning assumption about the extent to which traffic would be delayed at the Channel ports in the event of no deal?
Well, the government has a whole host of assumptions for this, and we obviously have to take into account a whole host of different factors. There are currently I know this committee is very familiar with the 106 technical notices that the government produced over the summer, and would have noticed that the thread that runs throughout those technical notices was a thread of continuity for things coming into the country. So we do not expect to have any changes for goods coming into the country. We keep the same checks that we have now. Everyone is aware of what happened in Dover and Kent in 2015 when there were strikes, bad weather, and the traffic problems chaos that caused at the time. And there's been a lot of concern in the papers and elsewhere about what would happen should our French counterparts, or the European Commission insist that our French counterparts firstly, if our French counterparts take no measures at all and just keep the infrastructure that they have in place in Calais at this point, and impose the full third country checks on a non-member state. So we obviously work on a reasonable worst-case assumption based around all those things, but we are very, very aware and keep constant surveillance on what is actually going on in France. So the French have just passed their no-deal legislation just before Christmas, in fact. On the 18th, France adopted its no-deal legislation in both chambers. But just before that, its European Affairs Minister, Nathalie Loiseau, said, "We stand ready for a no deal. The French government is now preparing the necessary decrees to protect the rights of citizens and maintain fluidity at the border in the event of a no deal." The laws I just mentioned do give powers to the French have appointed a no deal coordinator. He's got powers to and instructed to ensure that flow continues on the French side of the channel. This is obviously very important to us because our problems would occur if the French side in somehow got bunged up, for want of a better phrase. He has been, we've been talking to him at a technical level, and he's been briefing businesses that are based on the French in North France who use the short straits to import and export.
But the government, Minister, the government must be sufficiently worried to have done the trial queuing system at Manston, to have entered into the 3 ferry contracts. Are you saying to us that, given what the planning that the French government has put in place, you are more or less worried than you were previously, or are you still preparing for the possibility of significant disruption?
Well, can I just finish the preparations? Yeah. And so what he's been telling businesses on the French side is that currently there are 2 border checkpoints in Calais. They expect there to be 10 by the time by the 29th of March. They build a border inspection post, which is for phytosanitary and animal checks, and I believe they've already got planning permission actually for a site south of Calais itself for consignments on lorries that might not have the correct paperwork to move away from the port itself to ensure flow through that. So, we obviously watch all this, but however, we are a responsible government until we actually see this being built, coming into operation. We will work on the most reasonable worst-case scenario, which is why we've taken the measures that we have.
Right. Now, the fact that the French have announced they're going to have additional checking points suggests pretty clearly they intend to check things. Mm-hmm. Does it not?
Yeah, I believe there are. It was in the it might have been in the speech that I quoted earlier, if not on an earlier date. It would be Mrs. Loiseau said. We are working with the measures taken to put in the customs infrastructures that ensure our controls are the least penalising possible at the entryway to the European territory, and also talked about there being 3 extra checks at that point. And if you were to read, I shall quote bits of this, if you don't mind, throughout the meeting, the partnership pack that's on the gov.uk website. we detail what those checks are likely to be.
But any additional time, which is why the government has taken the contingency arrangements, then leads to stuff backing up.
And that is the problem. Any additional time, which is so especially based, if you're based on what infrastructure is in Calais now, then yes, we'd have a problem.
Now, in 2014, the Prime Minister said, at the time there was a debate about whether we should rejoin the European Arrest Warrant, that a decision not to do so would significantly diminish our power to remove these people, risking our biggest urban areas becoming safe havens for European criminals. If we leave with no deal, we would no longer be part of the European Arrest Warrant. Is that correct?
Yeah, we'd have to go back to agreements that we previously had
before. Well, is it still the government's view that in that eventuality, our biggest urban areas would risk becoming safe havens for European criminals?
Well, it's not my view, and I've not heard it articulated by anybody else.
Well, the Prime Minister, when she was Home Secretary, said that in 2014. Has the government's view of that changed?
Well, I have not heard that from government since that point.
You haven't, right.
So I would say it's not the government's view that would be the case.
It's not, so you disagree with what the Prime Minister said when she was Home Secretary in 2014?
I'd say it's just, that's just not the case anymore.
That is not the case anymore. So what has changed?
Well, the fact that we are much further down the line of being prepared for leaving without a deal, and therefore working up the instruments and the things that we would need to maintain a decent cooperation on security with our European partners.
So what would be the replacement mechanism for the European Arrest Warrant that would ensure that our biggest urban areas did not become safe havens for European criminals?
Well, we would, as I said earlier, we'd revert to some of the... Actually, in my lovely briefing, I've got a whole host of different reference points. But essentially, we'd revert to agreements that we have, and we'd try to negotiate a new security arrangement on a bilateral basis with the European Union itself, and indeed with individual countries for... We'd use Interpol because we get the messages that you would receive about individuals using the SIS2 system now on an individual basis through Interpol. There's a whole host of things we could be. It just would not be as good as the current system that we have now.
Right. Now, in the event of no deal, the government would need to roll forward the 40 or so trade deals that we're currently party to because we are members of the European Union. Could you tell the committee how many of those agreements has the government got the consent of the other party to roll forward in the event of no deal?
Yeah. So we are party to and I believe when my Secretary of State appeared before you just before Christmas, there was a conversation about that here. We are party to a large number of EU international agreements through our EU membership, and the EU treaties database does carry a hugely long list on this. But not all of these agreements actually need action as a result of our exit from the European Union. In fact, the vast majority do not. Some of these have been superseded because, for example, they've been amended over time as the terms have changed or new countries have joined the European Union. For example, the old trade-related agreements with Canada, which have been superseded by CETA, or agreements with countries that have since acceded. Some are not applicable to the United Kingdom, such as the agreement between the European Union and European microstates regarding the use of the euro, and agreements with third countries relating to short-stay visa waivers, which the UK does not participate in. And in some instances, we've signed the agreement as a member in our own right, and so our membership will continue, including for a large number of the multilateral agreements, such as the WTO and climate change agreements. And we've been obviously working throughout the course of the last couple of years to identify which agreements are relevant, important, and need action. And these discussions are well progressed and in many cases are ongoing. So it's very difficult to actually put a precise number on the volume of agreements requiring transition as a result from our exit from the European Union. However, the number of replacement treaties will inevitably be much lower than the full list on the EU treaties database. We obviously will always keep Parliament and stakeholders updated as replacement treaties are put in place. But for example, we have already announced that the 10 new EU aviation agreements have been finalised with some of our most important routes and markets, including the US, Canada, and Switzerland. We've signed 5 nuclear agreements which have passed through parliamentary scrutiny here already. And there are a number of trade agreements that we're working on in great detail. These are ongoing negotiations with our partners there, very important ones that involve a great deal of work at the highest level. And I'm sure you'd have noticed that Prime Minister Abe, the Japanese government leader, is coming across at the end of this week, and that'll be a matter of discussion there. And there are a number of multilateral agreements that we're working towards our own independent membership of, including the Global Procurement Agreement, and we've acceded to the Common Transit Convention and the 2 Hague agreements that I know this committee has shown some interest in previously.
Well, there's obviously a lot of work going on. But coming back to my question, which is how many of the countries with whom we have agreements relating to trade have to date said, yes, we will roll it forward? I mean, let's just be specific. Has Albania agreed to do so?
I haven't seen the Albanian agreement. One of the most significant trade agreements that we have rolled for British companies exporting £19 billion worth of goods and services was our agreement that was announced just before Christmas with the Swiss trade agreement.
Well, no, I've got the Swiss thing, but Albania you can't say. Central America Association Agreement?
Again, ongoing.
The discussions are ongoing.
Yeah.
Chile?
Ongoing. I mean, most of the ones you're about to read out to me are in... So
if they're ongoing, they have not yet been concluded, and that means that they haven't yet agreed to roll forward the arrangements. Is that correct?
The negotiations are ongoing.
But we haven't yet concluded a deal. We've got just over 2 months to go. So if I read out the whole list, you'd say they're ongoing?
Yeah.
Right. So with 2 months to go from a potential no deal, and a large number of these agreements, we haven't got an undertaking from the other parties that they will roll them forward.
We are not at the stage where we can initialise agreements and put them on the floor of the House for the CRAG process to...
Okay, well, there's not long to go. That is very helpful. And finally, from me, what are the 1,000 or so British police officers being trained to do in Northern Ireland in the event of no deal?
Police numbers in Northern Ireland, they're being trained to do police work in Northern Ireland.
But what additional work is it expected they might have to do in the event of no deal?
I don't think there's any work that's expected to do in the event of no deal.
Well, why are there 1,000 British police officers, as it has been reported, being trained to support the police service of Northern Ireland in the event of no deal?
I think a member of your committee might have commented on this in saying that, who represents a Northern Ireland constituency, in saying that there's often a rise in police numbers as you head towards marching season.
The marching season? Sorry, did you say marching season? Yeah. Well, the marching season has been last year, the year before that, and
yeah, I know. And
it's July, and I'm not aware that has been called upon previously. My understanding from the reports I've read was that this is specifically to provide assistance in the event of no deal. Can you confirm whether that is or is not the case?
I don't believe that is the case.
You don't believe that is the case? Okay. Right, Vera Hobhouse, thank you.
First of all, what you said earlier, you conceded that a no deal is really not what the government would like to see because it's not good for the British economy in the short and long term. So a responsible government, in which hand it is to absolutely make sure that no deal is happening, how can a responsible government not rule it out? That's my question. But preparing for something that is going to be bad is not the same as actually ruling it out if it is in your gift to actually rule it out.
A responsible government prepares for every eventuality. No deal is certainly a possible eventuality.
The government has it in its gift to rule out no deal.
But it is something that could happen to this country based on the fact that we have activated Article 50, and it could happen on the 29th of March. It would be irresponsible not to prepare for it.
The government could rule out no deal, and a responsible government could rule it out. It's in your gift.
No, a responsible government has to prepare for every eventuality. I'm afraid I completely disagree with you.
Can I come back to the Dover-Calais crossing? Because we met as a committee over a year ago now, and we met with a representative from the port of Calais. And we understood quite clearly that while on the Dover side we can have holding stations in Calais, they're not going to make preparations because, as they simply said, we have got a migrant crisis. So if they have anywhere where lorries can be stacked, they've got a huge issue with people trying to jump onto these lorries, so it's not going to happen. And he said quite clearly, basically in that case, the port of Calais would close. Have you had similar discussions with them, or has this now been resolved?
So we've had plenty of discussions at a technical level with the various people in Calais. However, as I hope I made clear in my answers earlier, so we will prepare for the reasonable worst case scenario, which is why you saw the testing of traffic flows in Kent earlier this week, and why the government has taken out the ferry contracts that was the subject of an urgent question and yesterday in this place. But we are very well aware that the French are doing everything they can do to ensure that flow continues there.
But worst case scenario in Calais is that the port of Calais is actually closing. Has the government considered that?
Yeah, of course the government has considered that.
So if the government has considered that, what would be the alternative to the port of Calais?
Well, it would be the... Firstly, this would be this is a problem that has occurred before, and it was actually a very dramatic what happened in 2015 with the strikes and the bad weather. I think it was 20 days that the port of Calais was essentially offline. As someone who pre-politics used to import fruit and vegetables and used that route a huge amount to do so, you have to make sure that you as a business have alternative routes to divert around. They do exist, but they are, again, I used the word suboptimal earlier, but they are suboptimal. The best thing about the short straits is that it's a very quick transition.
Right. But the worst deal scenario for which you're planning is must be the closure of the port of Calais. What would be the alternative to the port of Calais?
Firstly, I generally do not expect that to happen, and so that is not our reasonable worst case scenario. That's a kind of worst case scenario. But we have, as you have already seen, we have got some alternative extra ferry capacity that the government has purchased, and we have been talking to businesses and working with business sectors about how you can use other ports and other routes to market in the United Kingdom and out of the United Kingdom into mainland Europe and beyond.
So which ones would they be, the alternatives to the port of Calais on the mainland of Europe? Have you talked to other countries, Holland, Belgium?
Yes, conversations have taken place with Ostend and Rotterdam and Zeebrugge, and
they could pick up the capacity of Calais.
I don't believe they could immediately, although there is a lot of capacity in those ports.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Minister. You referred to a member of this committee suggesting that 1,000 additional police officers for Northern Ireland might be related to the marching season. You don't seriously believe that, do you? You know perfectly well this is not to do with the marching season, is it?
I do not know why the extra numbers of police are going into Northern Ireland, but I believe it's a regular occurrence that numbers are inflated.
But it is a fact, isn't it, that the additional funding from the Treasury that was included in the statement shortly before Christmas explicitly referred to the recruitment of additional police officers in Northern Ireland with no equivalent additional officers needed in the rest of the United Kingdom, specifically to deal with no-deal contingency planning. That's what that Treasury statement was about, wasn't it?
The Treasury statement, I think, included funding for 390, if I recall, extra police in Northern Ireland at the time.
Right. Part of your remit is planning for contingency planning for no deal. That's correct, isn't it?
I do not think the police numbers that you're talking about are related to contingency planning for no deal. But just in case I am incorrect, I will go away, I'll check, and I'll come back to this committee very quickly indeed. But I don't believe so, and certainly it's not been included on any of the briefings around contingencies that I've seen in my ministerial role.
Okay, thank you. When I and some of my colleagues raised questions about freedom of movement at Brexit questions shortly before Christmas, your ministerial colleagues said that effectively the decision to end free movement is a UK decision, and that as long as Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, these decisions will always be taken on a UK basis. Is that still the government's position?
Yes.
Are there any major decisions of that kind where Scotland and the government's view should be allowed to take a different path where we're part of the United Kingdom?
You'd have to identify what sort of decisions you'd be talking about. Obviously, I don't know what the sort of things you mean.
Can I take you back to the document that was published by the Scottish Government quite early on in the Brexit process, Scotland's Place in Europe, which has been updated a number of times since then? Can you tell me what parts of either the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration are different as a result of those documents?
As someone who did not draw up the withdrawal agreement nor the political declaration, I can't.
The fact is that nothing has changed as a result of those submissions, has it?
I honestly couldn't say that.
Could I ask you perhaps to write to the committee once you find out what, if anything, in the withdrawal agreement is different as a result of representation?
I'd be very surprised. Yeah, of course.
Okay. Thank you. Can you explain why the government suddenly started to talk up the badness of no deal at exactly the same time as it became obvious that you were going to lose the vote if you'd taken it before the House before Christmas?
I think you would find that there has been a minister in the Department for Exiting the European Union with responsibility for no deal from the very beginning, from when the department was set up. Obviously, when you're negotiating in hopefully very, very good faith with friends to get a new agreement, you want to talk about the agreement that you hope to strike. And I think there has been an ongoing debate within government and indeed outside about how much of planning for a deal not taking place you would openly talk about whilst trying to get the deal that you passionately want over the line. However, since I took up this role last summer, I mean, one of the first things I did was be introduced to an official who started work on planning for no deal in my department. I think his first commission, he told me, was in August 2016.
My question wasn't about planning for no deal. My question is about the fact that we got it dinned into us that no deal is better than a bad deal, and that no deal wasn't a particularly bad thing. And then, over a very short period of time, the government's position was that no deal is something very, very bad.
I think there were plenty of stories last summer about, and some of them completely bizarre stories, but there were plenty of stories nearly every day last summer dominating our press and our media about the consequences of no deal. So I don't think you can say there's not been a discussion on the suboptimal nature of us leaving the European Union without a deal.
It's fair to say, though, that anything, whether it's a bad deal scenario or a no deal scenario, that leads the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland to ask for a significant increase in the police officers is probably not going to be something very good. Police don't tend to ask for additional officers in order to deal with good news, do they?
I wouldn't comment on that.
Right. Do you agree with the Prime Minister that if the deal is voted down, it's possible that Brexit might not happen?
That's an excellent question. I mean, in government, in terms of so the legislation is set out now, and the fact that we've activated Article 50, I actually still believe that we will be leaving the European Union on the 29th of March at 11 p.m. Is there a parliamentary route by which Brexit can be stopped? I do not believe so.
So you're disagreeing with the repeated statements from the Prime Minister, including statements she's made from the dispatch box before the House of Commons, when she said that a possible consequence of voting down her deal is that Brexit might not happen. Are you now telling us you disagree with
I'm
that?
simply stating the fact that we activated Article 50 nearly 2 years ago, and with the legislation that we have passed to run alongside that, if we do not leave with a deal, currently we would be leaving without a deal.
The government has it within its power, should it decide to do so, to ask Parliament for agreement to either unilaterally revoke Article 50 or to ask for an extension in order to avoid the damage of a no deal. I'm not asking you whether the government intends to do that or whether you think it would be a good idea, but it is the case, isn't it, that the government could ask Parliament for that approval?
It's not government policy to do that.
No. Right, Minister, I'm not asking what government policy is, because part of our job is to scrutinise government policy and to maybe suggest places where the government have got it wrong. It is a fact, isn't it, that if Parliament refuses to endorse the deal the Prime Minister has just now, that one option available to the government, rather than throw us into no deal, one option available is to ask Parliament to put the brakes on either temporarily or in the longer term, should the government decide that. So the government at that point effectively can choose, do we plunge out with no deal or do we slow down the process to look for a better deal? The government has that opportunity.
It's quite simply not government policy to revoke Article 50. We saw what happened in the court case, understood the ramifications, but it is not the government policy.
What you're in fact saying, Minister, I know that you're very reluctant to tell me to disagree with my statement. I'll give you a further chance to contradict if I'm wrong here. The government could prevent a no deal from happening even if Parliament refuses to back the Prime Minister's deal next week or at any other time. Isn't it the case?
Mr. Grant, you could stop a no deal from happening by voting for the deal.
I could, yes.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah.
Are you likely to contemplate that?
No.
Minister, can I say, Minister, I'm quite happy at some point to be there answering the questions. I think my position and my national parliament's position and indeed my nation's position is perfectly clear on this. I'm asking you to confirm that, notwithstanding any decision that Parliament might take to try to initiate proceedings to slow the process down, the government has that opportunity, so that in the event that the deal is voted down either next week or at any other time in the future, it is not the case that the only course of action open then is no deal. There is another course of action open. Why are the government so determined to tell us that it is a state choice between this deal and no deal, when patently, obviously, that is not true?
Because a large number of the people sat around this committee room were elected on manifestos that were delivering on a referendum result where 17.4 million people voted to leave the European Union, and not doing so would be going against the wishes of the British people.
How many people around this table were elected manifestos that said we would leave the European Union without a deal?
Well, if 80% of us were elected on manifestos to take us out of the single market and customs union, I would suggest that 20% would be the answer.
Well, 20% voted for no deal.
No.
Isn't it a fact that there's nobody currently in the House of Commons who's elected in a manifesto?
So I might have misheard. Could you repeat your previous question?
You referred to the number of MPs who were elected in manifestos that said they would carry out the result of the referendum.
Yeah.
Isn't it a fact that none of those manifestos in which anybody was elected to the House of Commons said they wanted to leave without a deal? Nobody elected MPs that said they wanted to leave without a deal.
Yeah, I don't believe there are many caveats in manifestos at all.
So you're suggesting that people who voted for Conservative MP, because I would assume you're familiar with your own manifesto, that people read the Conservative manifesto and it was reasonable for them to think this could take us out without a deal with all the damaging or suboptimal.
I think when you're standing on a manifesto whose theme is to respect the result of the 2016 European Union referendum on our membership of the European Union, and the result of that referendum was to leave the European Union, you would expect that party and any other party that stood on a similar manifesto to deliver on that commitment.
Which of the Vote Leave campaigns during the referendum said they were campaigning to leave without a deal?
Well, they all campaigned to leave the European Union.
No. Yeah, they all campaigned on the basis that there would be a good deal at the end of it. That is the case.
I have to say, I'm not sure. One, this is relevant to us leaving without a deal, because there is a deal on the table which I genuinely wish people would take another look at, because the one certain way of avoiding leaving without a deal is to leave with a deal, which we have on the table. It's a perfectly good deal that's been negotiated over a long period of time. But I am quite confident that when the British people voted to leave the European Union, they voted to leave the European Union, and they weren't. There were not many debates at the time about what sort of method of leaving. They just wanted to leave.
Just final question, yeah, because we need to move on.
Such a good deal. Have you been given any indication as to why the Secretary of State responsible for that deal resigned as soon as it was published?
Only what I've read in the papers, so the same as you.
It's the first time in history that anybody has resigned in protest at the success of their own department's work.
Do you know, in British politics, I very much doubt that.
Right, okay. Stephen Timms.
Thank you. Can I ask some questions about the position of UK citizens currently living elsewhere in the EU in the event of exiting without a deal? The Department's paper on citizens' rights, published last month, called on Member States to set out details of how they will protect the rights of UK nationals in the event of no deal. Have any of the 27 Member States so far done that?
Yes, actually. I know earlier I was talking about the French suite of laws that were passed on the 18th. That includes those guarantees. I believe, if I may check my notes, that on the 12th... so obviously... I know you do not need this scene setting, but obviously most people in this country and most people in Europe were hoping that we would vote for a meaningful vote and get the deal over the line, and therefore not have to be preparing for this manner. But most countries, most member states have been doing some preparation, some behind the scenes, some quite overtly. From when the meaningful vote was delayed, there's been a lot of action, and it's become much more visible. So, for example, on the 11th of December, Ireland announced a swathe of plans for its no deal. We obviously have a special relationship with them in the travel area. On the 12th of December, the German cabinet adopted its no deal legislation, including what it perceives to be reciprocal rights for Brits. On the same day, the Swedish had a very big governmental preparation meeting. That week, the Dutch published its draft Brexit umbrella bill, or as it's formally called, the Consolidated Brexit Act. On the 18th, as I mentioned, the French adopted their no-deal legislation in both chambers. And on the 19th, the European Commission published their communication on preparedness, which detailed what they would expect member states to do. So even in that last week before Christmas, when, as you would understand, none of those countries want to be preparing for no deal. They'd much rather get the deal over the line. There was a huge amount of movement.
So it sounds like six or seven have said what the position is.
Well, the overarching one is the European Commission piece, which was published on the 19th, which I can happily share, and I've actually got in my papers I could read out. But they talked about the rights that UK citizens could expect in the European Union going forward.
So it takes the specific question of continuing access to the health service locally. Clearly, there will be UK citizens living elsewhere in the EU who will need to continue using the health services in those countries after Brexit. Can they now be reassured that they will have access to the health service in the event of no deal?
In some cases, yes, but not in all at this current point in time.
So are you able to tell us where they can be reassured about that? Which countries?
If I may be so bold as to do a tiny advert for the new portal on the gov.uk website, which if you're a UK, as you come into the website, you get 4 options. If you're a business or if you're an individual, if you're a UK national living in the EU is one of those options. You then get a couple of click-down menus as to which country you're in, and it then goes to the sort of information that you're talking about, you've been questioning me about, where we are currently on
right.
If you went there later today, on what has been assured so far, and as we get more information and as we come to different agreements with different member states, that will be populated on a daily basis.
For UK citizens living in France at the moment, can they be confident they will continue to be able to access the local health service if we leave the EU?
I do believe that was mentioned in the no deal legislation, yes.
It was mentioned.
I do believe it's part of that. Again, I haven't read every single word of the French legislation, but I believe that is the case, and if I may, I will write back. Well, actually, I will check on the website and come back to you.
Okay, thank you. Spain, is anything yet from Spain?
No, those discussions are continuing.
So at the moment, the position in Spain is not clear.
That's correct.
Can I just ask about another? Access to the health service is obviously very important. Another area is around receipt of pensions. So those UK citizens who are receiving part of their income from state pensions elsewhere in the EU because they've worked in those countries in the past, are there any potential difficulties in continuing to receive those pensions?
Not in continuing to receive them, no.
You're happy that will be fine. Can I now ask the government's paper in December accepted that some people will feel they need to come back to the UK in the event of a no-deal Brexit. If they do come back and if they are job seekers looking for work, would they have to satisfy the habitual residence test in order to qualify for benefit in the UK?
I believe from... I don't want to give an incorrect answer. So if you don't mind, can I write back to you on that? Because I believe that it is the case, but I'm not
certainly it is the case at the moment.
Yeah.
If you come back from somewhere else in the EU and you're looking for work, you do have to satisfy the bit. Normally means you have to wait around 3 months or a bit longer before you can.
I believe that is the case, but I have a flicker of doubt in the back of my mind, so I much prefer to write back with a clear answer.
I think that's quite important that
I believe it is 3 months.
That we know that. Can I just ask one final question in a rather different area? The British Retail Consortium was briefing members of Parliament yesterday, and they made the point that meat products can only be exported from the EU through a border inspection point, and at the moment Calais is not a border inspection point. Were you saying earlier that the French government has announced that it does intend to make Calais a border inspection point?
It has talked about building. Yes, it has talked about building a border inspection point at Port of Calais. Yes.
has it committed to doing so?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Crabb.
Good morning, Minister. Can I start by asking you, what is it about a no-deal outcome that makes you personally believe it's suboptimal?
Well, yeah, that's a terrible question to ask a good Eurosceptic. But as someone who worked in the European Parliament for 10 years and who has friendships and I'd like to think some understanding of people and the cultures of the European Union, I just think it would be much better to have a deal that satisfies those friendships, allows them to continue in an uninterrupted basis, be it for trade, tourism, whatever it might be. And so whilst a no-deal outcome is suboptimal, it's nowhere near as bad as maybe some of the newspaper reports have been in the past.
What concerns you most about it? Is it the potential short-term disruption, uncertainty, or is it the longer-term consequences of taking the biggest possible step away from an integrated trading relationship with the single market?
Well, personally, I think that. So I actually, and I'm going to get some daggers from some people looking at me from around this committee table. But when I campaigned to leave in my constituency, I campaigned on ending freedom of movement. I campaigned on keeping control of our money. I campaigned on having control of our borders and having control of our laws. And I think that the deal we have on the table does that. And so I see the deal as being optimal, and therefore the no deal is suboptimal.
Okay, thanks. Does the phrase "managed no deal" have any currency within Whitehall at all? Is that a phrase that you use on a day-to-day basis?
It's a phrase I do not use at all.
So would you agree with, say, the Institute for Government that it's a meaningless phrase?
Well, I would like to suggest that in the huge amount of preparation for a no deal, which we do not want to happen, we'd much rather leave with a deal, but in the huge amount of preparation that the government is doing, we are doing our best to manage the process of no deal.
In your working assumptions of what a no deal scenario might look like, and you talked, I think, about a reasonable worst case scenario, I think is the kind of basic planning assumption. What is the posture assumed of the EU and EU member states in that scenario? Is it one of cooperation, wanting to reach bilateral side deals, compromises, short-term working relations, get through the impact?
It's based on more than that. For example, if we were to talk about data adequacy, the European Commission has said that it would not, currently, it will not give us a data adequacy agreement until we have become a third country, and then we can negotiate a data adequacy agreement. That gives us a gap. It gives us it's one of the issues that my department is looking at. Well, actually, we're not looking at it. All the no-deal preparation is done within individual departments that are in control of their own plans and policy. DCMS are in charge of that, and the Information Commissioner launched just before Christmas a website to give companies the various wordings for how they need to change their any contracts for data adequacy requirements. However, we will be treated as a third country from the 29th of March, and then the European Commission has said that it would be willing to negotiate with us a data adequacy agreement, which we believe, as we were coming from an adequate position 1 minute before 11 on the 29th of March, should be relatively quick, but has taken in other situations in Europe 6 months to a year. So, I give that example to try and answer your question. So some of these things will be dealt with over time. The issues we have in the short term will be dealt with over time by in cooperation with the European Union Commission. So I don't see them as being negative or hostile, but I can't actually take into account them treating us specially more than they would any other third country.
Do you think it's fair to say that we will be relying to a very great extent on at least some basic measure of goodwill and cooperation from certainly the likes of France, the Netherlands, and some of the other closer member states to manage no-deal impacts?
Yeah, I don't think we'll be relying on it. However, I would like to think it does exist anyway.
And do you think there's a likelihood that the EU will turn around in the event of a no-deal, given that we are looking to them centrally and to some member states for assistance with managing no-deal? Do you think there's a likelihood that they will turn around and make asks of us in the event of a no-deal that might look similar to some of the requirements that are currently in the withdrawal agreement around citizens' rights, around money, maybe around assurances, around the border?
Yeah, I mean, we've made actually a very big offer on citizens' rights to EU citizens in this country in the event of a no-deal that goes further than the European Commission's offer, as it were, back on the 19th of December.
But do you get any...
But would there be asks? I honestly don't know the answer to that question, because I do think there would be a residual understanding and goodwill, but I'm not convinced, and I wouldn't like to rely on it at all in any of the plans that we would make as a government. However, we are, where sometimes in this debate we forget that we will have on the 30th of March exactly the same standards on many of the items we will be negotiating to have some sort of parity or agreement with our European Union partners, as we did on the 29th of March. So where lots of the agreements that have taken place in the European Union with third countries take some time because of the level of standards, we simply will not have that issue, but it still will require negotiation in some areas.
And finally, can I just have one more brief question to end? Very grateful, Minister. When you look across Whitehall and survey the levels of preparation going on for a no deal, which government department keeps you awake at night?
Oh, I would never say the Treasury. Well, none of them keep me awake at night, because there is a huge amount of work that's been going on across Whitehall for 2 years on this, and if I may be so bold, I can only say I've been unbelievably impressed by the civil servants I've come across who are dealing with this, both in my department and the others who are dealing with it, because there are some quite complicated problems and issues that I don't know if you can recall, Mr. Crabb, the balance of competences review that was done by the previous coalition government, where a review that was commissioned to look at where European Union and the UK were entwined to a certain point, so I guess to satisfy whether it could easily be unentwined. I think that fairly well massively underestimated how entwined UK government and European institutions and law is, and so the amount of work that our civil servants are putting in to get to the point where we could leave with a deal and it be very good for us, and where we could get to a point where we could leave without a deal, and whilst it being suboptimal, we would do well enough. This is super impressive.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan Ginolfi.
Thank you, Chairman. One vital aspect of our Brexit preparations, whether or not we have a deal, will be dealing with the secondary legislation that needs to go through the House. In December, we had Professor Barnard come to the committee, and he said that there are about 700 pieces of secondary legislation that will need to be adopted. Could you please say whether you agree with that figure? How many statutory instruments can Parliament expect over the coming weeks before Brexit, and when are they expected to be laid?
Yeah, I certainly can. There is, I guess I should start by thanking both the members of the committee and other parliamentarians for the amount of work they've already done on this, because I think most people in this committee, and certainly everybody we know, has been sat in, examining and scrutinising secondary legislation for a no deal. We asked a couple of months before Christmas for departments to distill what statutory instruments were essential to have in place. and finalise policy content and combine measures where appropriate, and in the hope that the final number of statutory instruments that we require would decrease. And thanks to the innovation of the sifting committee, the process for there's been a very good, almost like triage process that the sifting committee has done, making sure that the appropriate SIs are positive or negative. And we now anticipate the number of statutory instruments required before exit day to be below 600. But as my Secretary of State in front of this committee and on the floor of the House has said, it's not possible to give a definitive number. To date, we've laid over 300, I think it was 304 as of Monday, of these SIs, more than half the number we anticipate we need. And we'll continue to progress the secondary legislation programme, as a responsible government would, to ensure a functioning statute book on exit day. So they are the numbers as we sit here.
Okay, but there is a timing issue here. I mean, your estimate for the number of SIs to be laid in October and November suggests that there should have been laid between 200 and 300. And you refer to the sifting committee. Well, in a letter to the sifting committee, you wrote that as of November, 138 SIs had been laid only. Have you matched your estimate in any month?
Have we? Well, we've so because of the prioritisation initiative that we took. So essentially, we kicked the tires on every SI to make sure that they're imperative, and all the important SIs will be through at least committee scrutiny in very, very good time. And so that which is why you've seen such a peak. So since that letter was written, as I say, we're now at the point where we've got 304 that have been in through committee.
So I'm not exactly sure how many sitting days we still have before Brexit, probably under 40. How will Parliament be able to effectively scrutinise the remainder of those in that time?
It will be able to effectively scrutinise. I'm extremely confident that they'll be scrutinised in the proper way and in the appropriate time. So yeah, I'm confident we'll have a functioning statute book.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to follow on slightly from my colleague Jonathan Janogly's question, can we therefore take it that as you are confident that time is available to scrutinise all the necessary secondary legislation, dark rumours about the February recess being cancelled are unjustified?
Well, had you asked me that 8 months ago when I was a whip, I would have been able to give you an answer, but that's something for the government business managers, and I'm certainly not one of those.
Indeed, but you are responsible for preparations for exit, and since this legislation is for that, you can tell the business managers, can you, that they do not need to worry about the February recess because you believe that we can get all the secondary legislation through in the existing... I can
happily tell the business managers that I'm confident we can get this secondary legislation through in the time we have timetabled, including with a nice February recess for you.
That is excellent news, thank you. Did you hear the Mayor of Calais this morning?
I didn't, but someone sent me a text saying I believe there was an interview with him on the Today programme.
There was. He said to the Today programme that trucks will be passing as they are doing today. He said that his port will only be checking for veterinary and sanitary controls, for which we have already been building infrastructure and parking, but that will not influence the traffic in Dover. We will not control exports, only asking the papers already. That's all. Is that your understanding as well?
My understanding is what I said earlier. I would like to think it would be as free-flowing as the Mayor of Calais would be, but the European Commission can insist on extra checks the border, and as I described earlier, we would expect, and as detailed in the partnership pack that's online, we would expect there to be a tiny bit more of a check than the Mayor of Calais said then, but maybe he's privy to information because that France can apply to the European Commission to waive checks, and maybe he's privy to information that I'm not.
Well, he did finish by saying there will not be a queue in Dover because there will not be controls. So where is the problem?
Yeah, I mean, and if everything worked well, if the border checkpoints that are obviously under construction, I've not had a report that they are actually under construction yet, so I'm still working on a reasonable worst case scenario where they're not, but as soon as conditions change and if we see construction of these things, then yeah.
Have you talked to the Mayor of Calais?
I've not personally talked to the Mayor of Calais. We have had representatives of government talk to the Mayor of Calais.
Can I suggest you do talk to the Mayor of Calais?
I'd be delighted to talk to the Mayor of Calais.
And can I also ask you that if the Mayor of Calais is wrong and there are queues, obviously that will impact on the UK, for which you are making preparation. Have you done any work to work out what the impact is on the Republic of Ireland?
There has been work done because we do know that 53% of Irish goods export are essentially come through the land bridge of the United Kingdom and head towards Dover, Folkestone to enter the European Union. So we do understand the figures, and we understand. So we know what the figures are, but we are working to mitigate for there being any problems, and so we hope, like British trade, we'd like to be unaffected. Irish trade would be also.
I mean, given that one of the principal obstacles to obtaining a withdrawal agreement appears to be the attitude of the Irish government, is this something that you have pointed out to the Irish government?
Fortunately, even though I do know Mr. Coveney of old, he was a member of the European Parliament when I was there, and we both sat in the European People's Party grouping. He happily, me not so. But I have not had any conversations with him or the Irish government about that. That's for ministers with grander titles than mine.
But will the government be including in their assessment of the consequences of potential delays the impact not just on the UK but also on other countries who use the UK in order to export into the EU? Yeah,
I know it is. I mean, Mr. Coveney has talked about this himself. I know this is not lost on the Irish government already, but if you would like me to ask my counterparts with grander titles to do that, I shall happily ask them to.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Christopher Cho.
Minister, have you really not seen the statement, the written statement that's going to be issued today by the Minister for the Cabinet Office?
I generally have not seen it.
But this is a statement which is entitled EU Exit Update. As the Minister responsible in a department, are you not concerned that you haven't even had this statement shared with you, the contents of it?
No, but I know it's gridded to go out. But as I obviously did not explain well enough earlier that my department is not in charge of plans or policy within each individual government department for its exit plans for from the European Union. We coordinate, and where there are issues, we bring different government departments, ministers and officials together to overcome issues and try to make sure that this is as seamless as possible. So this is, whilst I know it is gridded to go, I've not seen it.
But you're quite relaxed about that.
Because
that's part of the course, not being informed as to what the Cabinet Office or the Prime Minister's Office are doing in relation to Brexit.
I think you're using it in a slightly different context, but I know it's ready to go. It's been in the grid for a little while, but because it's a plan that is kind of flagged green, as it were, I haven't looked at the detail of it at all.
You've told us that you regard the negotiated withdrawal agreement as a good deal. But would you accept that ultimately it's a matter for Parliament to decide whether or not it's a good deal?
It's a matter of for Parliament and individual parliamentarians to decide in the meaningful vote, yes.
So if individual parliamentarians collectively decide that it is not a good deal, then we revert to the situation where the Prime Minister is committed to a policy that no deal is better than a bad deal. As I hopefully articulated earlier, because we have triggered Article 50 and that 2-year period runs out on the 29th of March at 11 p.m, if we do not have a deal at that point in time, then we would leave the European Union without a deal. So you and the rest of the government would respect the decision of Parliament if they find that this deal is a bad deal?
So government would... I and government would very much like there to be a deal with our European partners, which gives us a transition period, gives business certainty and continuity, and us a chance to have a period of time where we can negotiate a very good future partnership with our European future trade agreement with our European partners. So
I accept that.
So
that's
a
what
deal
you'd like.
is much preferable to leaving without a deal.
But my question is, if Parliament decides in its wisdom or ignorance that this is a bad deal, will the government respect that and then, following on from that, carry on with its commitment, which is that no deal is better than a bad deal?
Obviously the Prime Minister ceased the debate on the meaningful vote before Christmas because she listened to what Parliament was saying about the problems that Parliament perceives with the deal. So we absolutely have a Prime Minister and a government that listens to Parliament.
But the motion before the House hasn't been altered at all, because the motion still talks about approving the negotiated withdrawal agreement laid before the House on the 26th of November. There's no change to the motion,
no,
or the content of it. So the debate is just on the same issues as it was before Christmas.
I look forward to the debate and the extended contributions that people can now have as we have an extra 5 days.
And the opportunity to speak on a second occasion. Can I ask you about what will happen on the 30th of March in the event of there being no deal in Ireland? How will things be different across the border between the north and the south on the 30th of March compared with the 29th of March?
I don't believe there will be much difference at all.
No. And so doesn't that emphasise the fact that all the problems put forward about scaremongering in relation to the border between the north and the south, that those are essentially a mirage which will disappear as soon as we leave without a deal?
There are obviously going to be some issues because as Northern Ireland will be with with us as treated as a third country by the European Union, and Ireland itself will still be within the European Union. Initially on day one, the differences are not going to be that great, but there could be divergence in tariffs further down the line, and I think to be fair to our European Union counterparts, they are right to be concerned about what that divergence might be like, and therefore I completely understand why the backstop is an important part of the agreement.
You're talking about further down the line.
Yeah.
But from what your earlier comments, it's quite clear that all the talk about a car crash or going off the cliff edge on the 29th/30th of March, that is completely an exaggeration of the reality.
I would like to think that we are, on a daily basis, ever more prepared for a no deal. The government's preferred option, obviously, is to leave with a deal, but a huge amount of work has gone into what might happen and what we need to be planning for were we to leave without a deal.
And you can reassure us that if there is no deal, then there will still not be a hard border between the north and the south of Ireland.
Yes.
Absolutely. So where is all this speculation coming from, being driven, it seems, by the government, to the effect that there is going to be a hard border, or there may be a hard border, if there is a no deal?
I don't know. It's a very interesting debate, but as I said, I can see why the backstop is a very important part of the withdrawal agreement, and I really do not think it relates to day one, because if you have the withdrawal agreement, that means you've voted for the deal, that means you've gone through the transition period, it means you've reached an agreement on your future partnership, which means you have an arrangement where you absolutely won't need a hard border, because you have an arrangement based on the goods that would flow across that border on tariffs and all sorts of things.
But contrary to what you've just said, isn't it correct that there would actually the backstop is total irrelevance? There's no need to have a backstop any more than there's going to be a hard border if there is no deal.
So I forgive me, but I would suggest it's quite important for the European Commission for there to be a backstop.
From the point of view of the European Commission. Yeah. But ultimately, that's a matter for them. If they want to introduce controls over the EU borders, that's for them, not for us.
In a negotiation where the European Commission will be looking to protect its four freedoms, where it will be looking to protect the integrity of its single market, I can completely understand why they would perceive a backstop to be important to them. I really can.
Yes, you can understand their perspective, but is there any evidence that the EU understands the UK and the Irish Republic's perspective that a hard border is absolute anathema and in contrary to the Good Friday Agreement and indeed contrary to the legislation passed in this House?
I'm sure there is. I'm sure that I've seen quotes in the past from Presidents Juncker and Tusk saying that, and they would have definitely understood from what our Prime Minister has said to them, and indeed what the Taoiseach has said to them about the importance of there not being a hard border on Northern Ireland, and the importance of the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, all the arrangements that we have now being maintained.
Okay. So finally, can I ask you whether you could and your department could do a bit more to reassure people both in the north and south of the border in Ireland that in the event of no deal, it's going to be business as usual on the 30th of March 2019?
I will happily take that away. In the event of no deal, we would become a third country to the European Union, and eventually, absolutely, there would be some changes.
Eventually. Thank you.
Okay. Right, Howard Williams.
Thank you, Chair.
Hi.
Good morning again, Minister. Can you tell the committee how confident are you that the government is ready to ensure that vital imports of food and medicines and other goods continues after the 29th of March, as before? Very. Are there any particular difficulties or any particular source of goods from, I don't know, ice cream or insulin? You know, are any particularly problematic at all?
No.
So there will be no change whatsoever, you think?
I would like to believe that we are well planned, and we have, that there will be very little change at all.
There's been a great deal of attention to food imports. How much attention are you giving to food exports? And I'm thinking specifically of agricultural goods such as Welsh lamb and beef, which overwhelmingly go to the European Union and which potentially might face tariffs up to, well, from 40% upwards, actually.
Yeah, we're giving a huge amount of attention to that. I believe the Secretary of State for DEFRA has articulated his concerns and views on what might come when it comes to tariffs on those products. We are well aware of the tariffs that there would be, and we would definitely be looking at, and we are looking at, ways of trying to ensure any problems are overcome.
Could you expand a little bit on that? What sorts of ways do you intend to take?
Well, actually, I really can't, because this is as I mentioned earlier, these plans and policies are owned within departments, and I know there's a huge amount of work that's going on within DEFRA. But for me, and no-deal planning, and that includes the kind of the tariff work that you talked about. For me, in no-deal planning, it's the importance of there's a database that we use for produce, etc., coming into the country from third countries called Traces, which is a database that's a European-held database. And therefore we have needed to set up our own database for import notifications. So we've set up an import notification system held within DEFRA, and my department's much been engaged on making sure that that is ready to go by ensuring that the Food Standards Agency, the Department of Health, DEFRA, whatever, all concerned, are ready to ensure that there's food coming in and leaving the country of appropriate quality. So. But the policy that you're mentioning is being developed within DEFRA. I'm
rather more concerned at this point about the exports of food from Wales and from elsewhere, and non-perishable foods as well, such as Scotch whisky. Do you know if DEFRA are actually talking to the Welsh Government at all, or even to the Welsh farming unions, to the NFU and
I'd be amazed if they weren't. There's been a huge amount of engagement across government departments with devolved administrations and business representative organisations, both in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and across the whole country.
Are you yourself aware of the delay and confusion around the Welsh Government's agricultural supports policy, and if you are, do you think that influences at all the prospects for a continuation of the exports of Welsh food?
I'm afraid I'm not.
Can I suggest that you have a look?
I will talk to my colleagues in the Welsh office.
Enlightening and highly entertaining as well for opposition parties. Can I turn now to the ferry question, and specifically on Seaborne? What assessment was carried out beforehand regarding the suitability of hiring a ferry provider that has no previous experience of running ferries and does not apparently own any ships, or has used websites apparently with terms and conditions that appear to have been intended for a takeaway food firm?
Well, as you would expect, and all these questions were answered by the Secretary of State for Transport yesterday in an urgent question, but the appropriate due diligence was taken, as you would expect, by a responsible government.
Was this particular contract, was it a one-off response to the urgent need to have extra ferry provision, or are you establishing a new way of laying contracts which would not require the sorts of usual conditions of competitive tendering?
It was one of 3 contracts that were announced. I think the other 2 were the FDS and Brittany ferries, to ensure, in a reasonable worst-case scenario, that we have extra coverage for the short strait. So, I'm quite convinced everything was done correctly.
And this was the Seaborne is the only British company of the 3.
Seaborne is the only. I missed the.
Seaborne is the only British company of the 3 companies which were successful. Was there any motivation at all following the debacle over the passport printing contract that there should at least be one company from Britain providing ferry services?
I know nothing about that part of the tender process.
Right. So, how are you going to ensure that due diligence is not being compromised in the interest of contracting services in time? Do you feel that there was a pressure of time here with the 29th of March approaching?
I don't feel that, and I think the Secretary of State for Transport detailed, in great detail actually, the process, the people, the companies involved, and what due diligence the government did in coming to the agreement with these 3 contracts, and remembering that nothing will be paid until service is delivered.
Can I just ask you one other point? It's a domestic point for Wales. Have you made any assessments of the need for extra ferry services between Wales and Ireland? And have you made any assessments of the impact of the establishment of direct routes from Ireland to other parts of France and Belgium.
So
does that figure in your thinking?
Well, I had the privilege of visiting Holyhead as a minister. Can't actually remember when. I think it was September, but at some point over the summer or just after, and had spent the day looking around the port, seeing what goes on there, and talking to the two ferry operators based there about the level of trade they have, the length of time of crossings, and what challenges they would have, both in a deal and in a no deal. So I'm fully aware of that. We are very confident, actually, that all the plans we need for Holyhead are in place. And I understand the point you're making, because the European Commission and the Irish government have been talking, or the Irish government, I believe, has asked the European Commission to look at whether there could be other routes to the single market from Ireland for product. But the reason there is so much that comes to Holyhead, then flows down through to Dover and goes across into the single market, is because it is cheap, effective, and works really well for those businesses. And if flow is maintained, there is no reason for that to change whatsoever. Our goal, the French government's goal, is to maintain flow.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Minister. You said earlier, in response to a question from one of my colleagues, that from the very beginning there was a member of your department in charge of no-deal planning, and that was from when the department was set up. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you also referred to there having been plenty of stories last summer about the consequences of no deal.
Yes.
I've got a copy of the contract notice here between the Department for Transport and Seaborne Freight. Now, you'll be aware, because you're obviously aware of what was discussed in the Commons yesterday, that this wasn't awarded by a competitive tender process. It was awarded under the negotiated procurement procedure without prior publication, as allowed for under Regulation 32 of the Public Contracts Regulations. And I'm reading there from the Department of Transport's statement. And you'll also be aware, if you're in charge of contingency planning, that Regulation 32 allows the government to avoid competitive tendering in cases of extreme urgency brought about by events unforeseeable to the contracting authority, i.e. the government. So this contract, which is dated the 28th of December last year, just a couple of weeks ago, was awarded without a competitive tender basis for reasons of extreme urgency brought about by unforeseeable events. Yet, your evidence is that there has been somebody from the very beginning in your department, i.e. 2 years ago, planning for no deal. So can you explain why the government have thought it appropriate, as a matter of law, to proceed under Regulation 32 for reasons of urgency, extreme urgency, and unforeseeable events, when the government has had somebody in place planning for no deal for 2 years?
A range of operators were invited to tender, including new entrants into the market and long-standing providers. Seaborne is one of the companies that we've awarded contracts to. Due diligence was conducted, and everything, I believe, was in order.
I'll ask the question again. Can you explain why the government proceeded under Regulation 32 for reasons of extreme urgency and unforeseeable events when you've been planning for no deal for 2 years? It's a very simple question, Minister. Can you answer it?
Yeah, a range of operators were invited to tender, and the correct due diligence was done to fulfil the plans that we require.
Was no deal an unforeseeable event?
Having spent so much time, energy and effort on trying to get a deal, I'd like to think that we would, and everybody in government, our sole focus has been to try and get the deal over, not sole focus, but the priority focus has been trying to get the deal over the line. I would suggest that actually that we did everything correctly.
What was the unforeseeable event that justified the government proceeding under Regulation 32 of the Public Contracts Regulations?
The tenders were awarded correctly.
What was the unforeseeable event that justified the government proceeding under Regulation 32 of the Public Contracts Regulations?
The tenders were awarded correctly.
I'll give you a third chance.
I'll answer the same.
So you don't know what the unforeseeable event was. You can't tell the committee.
The tenders were awarded correctly. Correct
Who
due
could
diligence
tell
was
us
done.
what the unforeseeable events were that justified proceeding under
I don't
Regulation
think-
32?
I'm not sure if anybody asked the Secretary of State for Transport that yesterday in the urgent question.
That's right.
There you go.
Who do you think could answer this? Do you think the Attorney General could answer the question? Because it's, as you're aware, a matter of law, and the government could be sued for breach of the regulations and also sued for damages.
I am not as eminent. I'm not a lawyer nor as eminent a QC as you are, Ms. Jerry. So I'm afraid I do not know the answer to that question.
So maybe I'd be better to ask the government's legal advisor what legal advice was given, and maybe he can tell us what the unforeseeable event was.
As a parliamentarian, you're free to ask any government minister.
Thank you.
Okay, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Chairman, and good morning, Minister. Thank you for coming in, your comprehensive answers. The Federation of Small Businesses is very concerned that small businesses haven't been paying proper attention to your notices, saying that 86% haven't done anything, though as 87% of our economy is not trading with the EU, it seems that 1% of businesses probably done something they didn't need to do. But, of course, leading on from that, and on the no-deal preparation notices, do you think it's an opportunity to remove burdens on business rather than uprate them to the level of those we have when we deal with countries outside the European Union? Thinking particularly of the export regulations, where the government's no-deal notice requires businesses to comply in the way that they now have to if trading with, for example, the United States. Wouldn't it be simpler actually to deregulate and put businesses dealing with the United States from UK government purposes on the same basis as those exporting to the European Union?
I understand the point you're making, but the policy decision was made to go down this particular route, and that's what we've done.
But doesn't that make no-deal preparations worse? Because instead of saying we will have a level playing field that is easier for everybody, it says actually we're going to put burdens on those who export to the European Union that are completely unnecessary.
I'd suggest the opposite. I'd say it probably makes it slightly easier because then you know that any country that needs to, any business that needs to export can use that partnership pack and go through the website and find the details that it needs to, what it needs to do to get its customs number, its IORI number, and an export. So,
but why is the British government asking for these things? I can understand why the country to which you export requires them. But the British government only really wants it for bureaucratic purposes, for statistical purposes. It's not any help to business. It's just a burden.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I'm afraid I'm not a Bayes minister, so I do not know what that department might do with this fantastically important information. So I can't answer. I do know, though, that we wanted to ensure that there was blanket coverage for businesses that wanted to export to the European Union and indeed beyond. And so the route we've gone down is as I've described.
So are the notices owned by you or by the departments whose area it is?
The technical notices.
Technical notices.
Each department is responsible for its own technical notice, policy, publicity, and other things. Yeah.
And is the area of responsibility for export form filling with the Department for International Trade or with Bayes?
I believe they're with Bayes.
Bayes. Okay, so it's Bayes who actually, not known to be the most enthusiastic ministry for Brexit, is making the bureaucratic burden higher rather than lower. And that's a policy decision.
I would, having not filled in the form, I don't know if it's a heavier bureaucratic burden, but the responsibility is the responsible department.
Thank you very much. That was all I wanted to ask you.
Thank you. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Minister. Could I ask what the government's policy is in the event of leaving without a deal on imposing tariffs on European Union goods into the United Kingdom?
You could. It's a matter of it's under discussion at the highest level of government at this point in time.
So we don't know.
It's not been formalised, and it will be announced very, very shortly.
And we know, presumably we know that the European Union's policy will be to impose tariffs on UK goods entering the European Union.
Absolutely.
So at this moment it would be possible that we would be not charging tariffs, importing, and yet our exporters would be facing tariffs. So a kind of dissonance between the two.
I honestly couldn't comment on that because I do not. So I don't want to set any.
In the event that the United Kingdom decided not to impose tariffs on goods coming in from the European Union, what would your assessment be of how we would then have to treat goods coming in from the rest of the world in regard of tariffs under most favoured nation rules?
Yeah. Forgive me, because I don't want to prevaricate, but this is policy that's wholly owned by the Department for International Trade, alongside its partners in the Foreign Office and ultimately the Prime Minister, and is at a stage where it's being in the finalisation of development. And I'm not privy to that information.
But you are the Minister responsible for preparations in case we leave without a deal.
I am the Minister with responsibility for
so with all due respect, and I have a great deal of respect, I don't think that's good enough, that you are not in that position 2.5 months before the relevant date to be able to advise the committee on that.
I mean, there are obviously a whole host of elements at play here. I can tell you that the system would need to run to collect and impose tariffs is ready to go with it. It would need to be, all the different tariffs would need to be entered into it for it to work. So the process that is required behind the scenes for it all to function properly is all set up, but the policy is in its final stage of development now.
Okay, thank you. Could I just turn briefly to the question of services? When I asked the Secretary of State on Monday regarding the position in the event of a no deal on services, he responded that there would be some, as you've already mentioned, considerable areas of uncertainty around data because we would not be a third country until the 30th of March, and there would be presumably quite a lengthy period of time before some agreement regarding data adequacy was reached. What is your view of the extent that uncertainty over data will have over our services industry, particularly our extremely successful services exports to the European Union?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of communication, and indeed part of the new advertising campaign that people would have seen was launched yesterday. Ask businesses and individuals to go to the gov.uk website, and one of the questions as a business, one of the first questions you find is, do you hold data, and do you know where you hold it, and a whole range of information and advice appears at that time. Interestingly enough, government holds a huge amount of data offshore as well in this modern day world. I guess you kind of expect that now. And huge amounts is held offshore and not in the European Union, but lots of people do not know where their business data is being held, and that's part of the advice is that you do need to find out, because to successfully and legally fulfill adequacy requirements, you will need to maybe change parts of contracts, parts of disclaimers on your website. All of that information is on the Information Commission's website and went up just before Christmas. But it's ensuring that businesses, especially businesses that deal with the European Union, are aware of that and take note of those plans and make the appropriate changes.
And finally, if I may, Chair, one specific question. Most exports these days, whether of goods or services, from the UK, particularly high-value exports, require an awful lot of toing and froing by people to go and service, whether it's to service software, to install software, whether it's to service aircraft engines, whether it's to service high-value machinery. What is your understanding of, in the, and I hope never event of a no deal, but what is your understanding of the position of those workers who will be required to go and service? Would they immediately be required to get work permits? I know under the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration, there is provision for visa-free short-term working precisely to cover such kind of arrangements.
Yeah.
But what would the situation be in the case of no deal, for instance, for an aircraft engineer going to service an engine in Berlin the day after, on March the 30th?
Yeah, that was something that was dealt with in the European Commission's announcements on the 19th of December, where I think it was quite widely reported in our press, but one aspect of it, which is the country you'd have to, as we became a third country in the future, Europe is going to have an ESTA-like document that third country nationals would have to fill before travelling online, which is going to cost €7. But the rest of the announcement went on to say that tourists and short-term business visitors for up to 180 days would continue without a visa as per normal.
So your understanding is that even in the event of a no deal, they would be able the next day to go and work on software in Holland or aircraft engines in Germany or whatever?
Indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Jenkins.
Minister, we saw what happened yesterday in the finance bill. Some of our colleagues trying to stop preparations and money going into no deal. I just want to start by completely agreeing with you. It's probably maybe the only time I will in the committee, but agreeing with you, it would be irresponsible of government to not prepare for no deal. Minister, would you agree that by taking no deal off the table, it actually weakens our hands in negotiations with the EU?
I would, yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Also, now, should the Prime Minister's deal next week fall, how many times do you estimate it being brought back to the House?
I have not seen any plans that suggest it would be brought back to the House.
Okay. That's good to hear. Yeah. I was looking at what the Prime Minister said on Andrew Marr earlier on in the week. That, she wouldn't.
Forgive me for not watching.
No.
The Marr programme.
Okay.
I'll never be forgiven. Or listening to the Today programme, obviously.
Absolutely.
I'm completely out of touch.
Should the Prime Minister's deal fall next week, is the government going to ramp up the fear-mongering surrounding no deal?
I don't think the government's being fear-mongering in the slightest. There are some consequences for us leaving without a deal that we have to prepare for, and I'd like to think that, where given the opportunity, I've articulated them in a calm and relatively precise manner without scaring too many horses, but giving a level of understanding of the amount of work that has had to go in to prepare for a no deal.
I agree with you, Minister, that you yourself, because I know as a Brexiteer that you probably haven't gone down that route, but I'm probably talking about the Treasury actually.
Yeah, I disagree. I think the government has actually handled its no deal preparation very responsibly.
Okay. Monday's no deal truck war game in Kent, where 100 lorries drove up and down the motorway. Was this a success, and what did it teach us about leaving under WTO rules?
We're going to talk as much about leaving under WTO rules, but it was a success. The government works with a body called the Kent Resilience Forum, and should there be issues, actually, whether it's deal or no deal, when we leave, there could easily still be problems with strikes and weather problems in the short straits that we would need to prepare for as a government. This was a way of finding out there were enough lorries, and I believe one dump truck, but present for us to measure the flows that we could of traffic that you could send out onto the A road that connected where they're parked up to the port, the timings and what that might do to traffic. So yes, it was a success.
It's been 2.5 years since the British people voted to leave. Now, is it a coincidence that this no-deal war game that took place this week, it actually took place before the Prime Minister's vote next week on the withdrawal deal? Why did it not take place, months ago or even a year ago? Why is it a coincidence?
Yeah, it is a coincidence.
Okay. Right, thank you. And regarding your previous answer with regards to Calais, that the EU could enforce more strident checks if they wanted to. Wouldn't you agree that that would be counterproductive because we could do the same with their goods, what comes into the UK as well?
It would be counterproductive because it would, as I mentioned earlier, I used to import and wholesale a huge amount of produce, fresh produce that use the short straits. And I know that at that time of year, a huge number of the lorries coming into the country contain fresh produce from French farmers, Italian farmers, Portuguese, Spanish, not so much the Dutch and Belgians because they also use other routes, but it would be in nobody's interest to impose any extra checks.
And finally, Minister, I was in Kenya back in July and they export flowers under WTO rules. So can you see any position where, if they can do it easily enough, get through our checks and still get goods to us on time, which has got a short shelf life, can you realistically, honestly see any problems if we leave on WTO?
I also used to import fresh produce from around the globe, and it is eminently doable in good time for it to have a long shelf, fresh produce to have a long shelf life in the United Kingdom from other countries outside the European Union.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Minister, for coming to see us this morning. Do you think that a no-deal Brexit makes the reunification of Ireland more or less likely?
No, I don't.
No, you don't?
No.
So it's been reported that the Northern Ireland Secretary said at Cabinet yesterday that a so-called border poll on the reunification of Ireland was far more likely if the UK crashes out of the EU without a withdrawal agreement. Do you not agree then with the Northern Ireland Secretary?
I wasn't at Cabinet to hear those words uttered. Thank you for elevating me into the Cabinet. I very much appreciate the thought.
No, I'm saying it's widely reported and has not been
lots
denied.
Lots of things are widely reported. You'd have to ask the Northern Ireland Secretary that.
Do you not think that there's a political likelihood, given the terms of the Good Friday Agreement and that an Irish referendum can only be called by the Northern Ireland Secretary if there's evidence that a majority in Northern Ireland would support reunification. Mm-hmm. Do you not think that if we end up crashing out of the European Union without a deal, that Sinn Féin would immediately request a referendum in Northern Ireland?
Firstly, I can't say I would like to put... I don't think I've spoken to a Sinn Féin member since the general election of 2017 in this place. Secondly, that is a matter for those people responsible. And actually, I just would slightly push back. We would not be crashing out of the European Union without a deal on the 29th of March this year. There's been a huge amount of preparation that has gone in to ensure that we would be leaving the European Union. I would much prefer to have a deal. If we were to leave without a deal, so if you and your parliamentary colleagues cannot bring yourselves to vote for the deal that's on the table, when we will leave without a deal, and a huge amount of preparation has gone into making that suboptimal outcome as comfortable as possible.
But your role is to assess all of the risks that relate to, and I'm sure you see opportunities there as well, but let's call it, for the sake of argument, risks and opportunities. Mm-hmm. That relate to leaving the European Union without a deal. Do you agree that one of those risks is the risk to the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom that is represented by a no-deal outcome?
No.
You don't think that leaving the UK with a no-deal outcome entails any risk to the potential, in terms of the potential breakup of the United Kingdom?
No.
Can you explain why not? Why you don't think? If you were just drawing up a sort of scale of 1 to 10, and you said, well, no deal versus a deal versus other options, are you seriously arguing that leaving with no deal would have no impact in terms of risk in the context of the breakup of the United Kingdom and specifically the reunification of Ireland?
I generally believe the union is a very strong union and it would maintain its strength.
But it's correct, isn't it, that under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, it is possible to hold a referendum in Northern Ireland if the Northern Ireland Secretary, it becomes clear that there is clear evidence that a majority in Northern Ireland would support reunification. Is that true, yes or not?
It has been ever since that agreement was signed.
And do you agree that leaving the European Union without a deal increases the likelihood of support for a referendum in Northern Ireland?
No.
Why not?
I just don't. It's a personal. I haven't travelled to Northern Ireland for a number of months. It's a personal belief. I do not.
But you can't. That's just a personal belief. You, as in your role as the minister responsible for assessing the risks that are associated with no deal, you haven't conducted any deeper research into this, what most people would think is quite an important issue, the future of our union.
The future of our union is strong, and I have every confidence in it maintaining.
But can you just confirm then, in your role as the minister responsible for assessing the risks around a no-deal outcome, no research or thinking or discussion has been done about, the scenario whereby we leave the EU without a deal and the impact that has on the likelihood that a party such as Sinn Féin would immediately request a referendum in Northern Ireland. No work has been done on assessing that risk.
I can confirm that I have not commissioned, nor have I seen any work on that basis.
Do you think it's a responsible attitude of the government to not be commissioning some work and thinking and assessing the political risks on this, what most people I think would consider as quite an important issue, the future of our union?
I'm quite sure that the Northern Ireland Secretary and the Northern Ireland Office consider all sorts of matters relating to that on an ongoing basis and have done ever since the Good Friday Agreement was signed.
But the Northern Ireland Secretary has, and I recognise this is reported in the media, so we don't have it, but it hasn't been denied. The Northern Ireland Secretary has told the Cabinet yesterday that leaving the EU without a deal would significantly increase the chances of a so-called border poll in Northern Ireland. So why do you not think that you would want to be, as the Brexit Department and the Northern Ireland Department would want to be coordinating and working closely together to assess the risk of a request to have a referendum in Northern Ireland, which would in essence have to be accepted by the Northern Ireland Secretary under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement? Don't you think you should have been working with... Were you surprised to read this report of what she said?
Forgive me, Mr. Kennett, but I refuse to comment on leaks of that nature. You're more than welcome to ask the Northern Ireland Secretary herself.
Thank you very much.
Sammy Wilson.
Just follow on that question. Given some of the extreme statements being made by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, especially about this agreement and vain attempts to sell this agreement, does it surprise you that she may have been reported in making another wild claim about why this agreement should be supported?
Mr. Wilson, again, as I said to Mr. Kinnock, I refuse to comment on leaks. I wasn't there, and I'm not going to comment on that. However, like the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and please forgive me because I understand the position you've taken on the agreement, but I am also someone who is out there selling the agreement.
Just to clear up the referendum issue, a request by Sinn Féin for a referendum under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement is not the trigger for for a referendum to be started or to be catered for. It is only when it is clear there has been a substantial shift in opinion in Northern Ireland, which would indicate that the majority of people wish to break with the United Kingdom. Was that not the case? And therefore, the premise of the question that Sinn Féin would ask for a referendum in the situation of no deal really is irrelevant.
It's my understanding that you are completely correct.
Could I just ask two questions? First of all, about the Irish government. The Irish government has produced its proposals for what it would do in the event of a no deal. Has any of those been shared with the government, with your department, or with the government of the United Kingdom? And have any of those proposals shown what infrastructure the Irish government would wish to place along the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and have they requested any similar information from the UK government as to what it would do on the Northern Ireland side?
I guess this is one of those committees where you get asked questions that people know the answers to better than you do, but as you would have seen from numerous statements from the Irish government and indeed ours, there are no plans for any infrastructure to be built on the Irish border.
Does it surprise you that in the event of a no deal, the Irish government have not proposed any infrastructure on the Irish border, given that the EU have said that infrastructure is absolutely essential to guard the integrity of the single market, yet there have been no proposals by the Irish government, and indeed they haven't even discussed with the UK government as what we might do on the Northern Ireland side?
It doesn't surprise me, because the Irish government, like the UK government, has a very good understanding of the history, political and social, and general culture of the island of Ireland, and so no, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
And that being the case, I mean, because you said earlier you understood why the backstop arrangements were required in the withdrawal agreement, but does it not appear to be somewhat contradictory that the backstop arrangements are required in the withdrawal agreement, and yet in the event of a no deal, the Irish government is not planning to put any infrastructure to protect the integrity of the single market on its side, and has not asked the UK government to put any infrastructure on its side of the border?
No, it doesn't surprise me, because that's what I would have expected.
So why then do you conclude that the backstop arrangement is necessary?
Because I understand, I guess it's from 10 years of being a member of the European Parliament before this particular role, and I hope I did emphasise that I had a proper job before politics as well. But 10 years of being a member of the European Parliament and the European Commission, one of its purposes is to protect its four freedoms and the single market. And I can completely understand why the European Commission would be concerned about that border.
It seems now the Irish government is prepared to defy the European Commission and say we're not putting any infrastructure up, and we're not even asking the UK government what it's going to do on its side of the border.
I think that there's a huge amount of common sense that comes out of Dublin, and a huge amount of common sense that comes out of Westminster on this matter.
I just ask another question about it's been widely reported that the police in Northern Ireland have, under the mutual aid agreement, asked for 1,000 additional officers, and it was reported that this was in event of street disorders due to Brexit and leaving without no deal. Are you aware of the application which has been made under the mutual aid arrangements and the terms which the police asked for that support in the first place?
So I'm afraid I prayed you in aid in your absence at the beginning of this, because I was asked about this, and I quoted from a statement that you actually put out about these numbers. But in the no-deal plans that I have seen in my department, there are no plans where we require extra police on the ground in the event of a no-deal in Northern Ireland.
So is it your understanding that this application for 1,000 additional police officers is the regular application which is made every year in respect of possible street disorders that may be around the parading in the July period, and officers which have never been required?
I mentioned that earlier. Other members of the committee might not have believed me.
But can you confirm that it is a fact that this is a yearly application which is made by the police in Northern Ireland, and it's an application which they have never ever had to draw down the officers from? For the rest
I believe that is the case, yes.
And then just one last area, and that's in relation to the preparations in Northern Ireland. Who's responsible for liaising with government departments in Northern Ireland as to in regard to the preparations for no-deal Brexit? Is it your department? Is it the Northern Ireland office? Or is it meant to be, if the Health Department's preparations in, it would contact the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, the Business Department would contact the Department of Economy? How exactly is it?
So my department kind of coordinates the whole thing, but it is departmental responsibilities extended. So, yeah, it would be DEFRA when it came to agriculture, for example.
Where has the breakup occurred then, or the breakdown occurred then? The head of the civil service has complained recently that in Northern Ireland that there appears to be no or a very poor flow of information as to what the preparations are, and that government departments in Northern Ireland have not been well prepared. In fact, he's talked about massive smuggling across the border, and I don't know who's going to buy all of these smuggled goods, given that supermarkets have very, very great traceability requirements when it comes to the food which they sell, etc. But he has anyway made this claim in a letter. So where do you see the breakdown occurring? Is it that departments here at Westminster are not making contact with departments in Northern Ireland, or that the Northern Ireland office is failing to pass on information to departments in Northern Ireland?
Well, theoretically, the departments are responsible for their plans and policies. In Northern Ireland's case, it would be coordinated by the Northern Ireland office. I would be surprised if the appropriate information, I'd be very surprised actually, if the appropriate information has not been flowing. And following this, I will go away and check that that is actually what level of information has been flowing, and ensure that any pipeline that might be blocked is unblocked, because there should be no reason for that flow of information being interrupted.
No fear that the Northern Ireland office may, given the vigour with which the Secretary of State, a vigour which she seems to have found for her role recently, which is maybe notably absent before, that the Secretary of State has, in defending this deal, that the Northern Ireland office may well have been reluctant or not as diligent in sharing information as to how to prepare for a no deal as it could have been.
No.
Well, it may be helpful if you can come back to us and let us know where, if you identify where the roadblock has been, because certainly the head of the civil service seems to be making the claim that information is not as freely flowing as it should. I will happily go away on that basis.
Okay. Can I just ask you, Minister, why do you think so many businesses are anxious about the prospect of no deal?
Because they'd much rather have a deal and the certainty that that provides.
Right. Let's take the farming industry. Yeah. In just over 2 months, beef and dairy farmers could be facing tariffs as high as 40%, which the NFU Cymru president has described as catastrophic, and the president of the NFU has described as the worst possible outcome for the farming industry. Now, what do you say to them when the government says, well, we might leave with no deal?
I say to them that the government has a deal on the table which they would agree is eminently preferable to leaving without a deal, and it is incumbent on members of this Parliament to vote, I know they, appropriately as they feel fit, but to look seriously at the deal that's on the table, which provides the certainty that industry and others ask for.
What is your plan to help them in the event that we did leave with no deal?
As I mentioned earlier, I shall ensure that the committee hears, as quick as I do, about the outcome of the arrangements that DIT and DEFRA are talking about.
Right. Now, on tariffs, you said the government had yet to make a decision as to what tariffs it might charge EU member states in the event of us leaving with no deal. Is it the government's understanding that if the government decided to charge no tariffs, would it then have to apply the same policy to every other country in the world under the MFN rules?
I think I am not an expert in the tariff field, so I'll vie away from answering the question, but I do believe you get a short period of time where you can vary tariffs, but eventually you have to come back to the position that you articulated.
Right, and if we did have to come back to the position which is we cut the tariffs for everyone, what have we got to offer in any trade negotiations if we've already given it away?
Well, whilst not accepting the whole premise of your question, we do have to offer the 5th largest economy in the country, in the world, with a growing economy and a growing and dynamic economy and market.
Right, but we'd have given away the offering of reduced tariffs in those circumstances. We'd have already given that away.
I don't accept the premise of your question.
Well, okay, you don't accept that. Okay, finally, what primary legislation will be required between now and the end of March for no deal?
We have a number of pieces of primary legislation that are currently before Parliament, and they are the pieces that are required. So we have the Trade Bill, the Fisheries Bill, the Agriculture Bill, Financial Services Implementation of Legislation Bill, that's for no deal especially, the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill, the Immigration and Social Security Coordination EU Withdrawal Bill, and the EU Withdrawal Bill itself, introduced when Parliament's approved the final deal.
No, but in the event of no deal, clearly...
There are financial services, the in-flight financial services Directors Bill, basically, to make sure that there's certainty for pieces of legislation that are currently on track. That's the Financial Services Bill. The Healthcare International Arrangements Bill is a reciprocal health bill.
Point I'm trying to understand is those are all bills the government's bringing forward in anticipation of there being an agreement.
No, those two are no deal.
Those two are right. They're for no deal.
Absolutely, yeah.
But do you expect any other additional bills to deal with the consequences of leaving with no deal?
I can't,
other than the list you've just read out.
I can't for certain say I do not expect any extra pieces of primary legislation, but I'm fairly confident that is the complete list.
That's the complete list. But there might be government amendments to those bills to take account of the fact...
Well, and things do change in all sorts of areas. And as I described earlier, how quickly things are changing as we are now pivoting the primary focus of government to no-deal preparation. If extra things are found, then there might be extra legislation required.
And are you confident that all of the necessary bits of legislation to deal with no deal would be completed by the 29th of March?
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming today. Your evidence has been extremely helpful. Order, order.
Podcast. The proceeding has ended.